the leftovers. Now, I'm going to try to connect a practical dot here to our daily lives. How many of us get caught up in the busyness of the day, and the first time we really sit down to have any fellowship or communion or devotion to Him, the first time we really sit down to get into it, I'm not trying to lay a heavy guilt trip, because I'm just as guilty as any one of you. Sometimes that phone rings and it sets your whole day in a motion, in a direction, and it develops a momentum. And I mean, there's no way to stop it. I mean, and sometimes your time in the morning is cut short, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just the reality of life, of daily life. But there are those days, and I'm not talking about that, because there's not much we can do about that. But what I am talking about, and I'm just as guilty as anybody else, I'm talking about when it finally comes time to have time with the Lord, it's the leftovers. We're beat tired. We open up the Word, and it's kind of like, okay, before we go to bed. And nothing wrong with reading the Bible before you go to bed. It's a wonderful cure for insomnia, by the way. You know what I'm talking about too, don't you? You open up your Word and right before, and I mean, what's left of you? You're pretty much done. And you read one verse, and if you get through a chapter, how many of you will read the chapter and you'll have to go back and read it again because you didn't really understand what you were reading, because you were thinking about what happened at work that day? Or you're thinking about that situation. I mean, you're reading it, but you're not really reading it. Your prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling. There just doesn't seem to be, that's leftovers. It's not the fresh, it's not the first, it's not fresh fire on the altar of our devotional life before the Lord. And so I think this is really one of the things that this points to practically. Verse 19, the flesh that touches any unclean thing shall not be eaten. It shall be burned with fire. And as for the clean flesh, all who are clean may eat of it. But the person who eats the flesh of the sacrifice of the peace offering that belongs to the Lord, while he is unclean, that person shall be cut off from his people. Moreover, the person who touches any unclean thing, such as human uncleanness, an unclean animal, or any abominable unclean thing, and who eats the flesh of the sacrifice of the peace offering that belongs to the Lord, that person shall be cut off from his people. And the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 22, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, you shall not eat any fat of ox or sheep or goat, and the fat of an animal that dies naturally, and the fat of what is torn by wild beasts, may it be used in any other way, but you shall by no means eat it. For whoever eats the fat of the animal of which men offer an offering made by fire to the Lord, the person who eats it shall be cut off from his people. Moreover, you shall not eat any blood in any of your dwellings, whether of bird or beast. Whoever eats any blood, that person shall be cut off from his people. So, one commentator has suggested that this speaks to the necessity of purity and holiness when participating in the fellowship meal as it relates to the peace offering. One said it this way: we can't enjoy fellowship with God or the peace of God until we've received the purifying and cleansing grace from God. So that's why the cleaning rituals and purification and not touching the unclean thing, and especially the blood. Verse 28, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, he who offers the sacrifice of his peace offering to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offering. His own hand shall bring the offerings made by fire to the Lord. The fat with the breast he shall bring, that the breast may be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. And the priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast shall be Aaron's and his sons. So, a couple interesting details here I want to draw your attention to just real quick. First, notice the parts that are given to the priests. They have the shoulders and the breasts. One has suggested that this symbolizes how they would shoulder the burdens of the people, and they would have, as symbolized by the breast, a heart for the people. Now, any of you who are involved in any way, in any facet or aspect of ministry, understand this. You, even as a believer, bear the burdens of other believers. Bear one another's burdens, we're exhorted to do in the New Testament. But in the ministry, it takes on an even more, I think, graphic meaning, if I can say it that way. When you serve people, when you minister to people, what comes packaged with that is a burden for the people whom you have the privilege to minister to. On the mainland, many years ago, I remember something that happened. I watched this couple. They ended up, getting a divorce, and I just was lamenting and whining and complaining and murmuring. And I called up my pastor, and I just said, "Man, I just can't believe it." And what could I have done? And I felt like a doctor who loses a patient in surgery. And it just, you internalize it, you take it so personally. And I was just so heavied by this, and so burdened by this, and so brokenhearted by this. And I was just carrying this thing with me. And his words to me were so wise. He said, "JD," he said, "if it didn't bother you or burden you, you wouldn't be a pastor." I mean, think about that. If you're not carrying it, if you don't have a heart for the people, not carrying the burden of the people, then really it means you don't care about the people. The fact that you would be so burdened by it, so upset with it, just means that you have a heart for the people. If you didn't care, you'd say, "Well, another one bites the dust." Is that a bad saying, by the way? Anyway, I hope not, because I just said it. There's another detail here. The shoulder and the breast that the priests would keep for themselves were to be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. Now, we've talked about this, but the wave offering was to be in a specific way. One Jewish rabbi described the wave offering as this. First, the portion was laid upon the hands of the donor, and the officiating priest placed his hands beneath those of the person offering the sacrifice, and moved the portion first forward and backward, then upward and downward, which would be in the shape of a cross. So again, I know I'm being redundant, but if I were to tell you that everything in the Old Testament points not only to the person of Jesus Christ, but the finished work on the cross by Jesus Christ, would you believe me? Would you believe that that's why and how important it is that we study the Old Testament? I've mentioned this before, but I love teaching the Old. This is my second time teaching through the book of Leviticus. And I'm finding so many more things, which is why we're probably going so much slower through the book than what we probably should be. But are you in a rush? Don't pressure me. I work well under pressure, but we'll get through the book. But I'm finding so many more things the second time through. And I have to say that, yes, we're in the New Testament on Sunday mornings in the book of Acts, but I really look forward to our midweek Bible study because we're in the Old Testament. See, in the Old Testament conceals what the New Testament reveals. In other words, when I teach the New Testament, it's so much richer because of my understanding of the Old Testament, because the Old Testament points to the New Testament. And what's the New Testament about? The person of Jesus Christ and the finished work on the cross. It's like watching a movie in 3D on the IMAX screen when you know the Old Testament behind the New Testament that you're studying. When I first got saved, I read through the Old Testament. No one told me to start in the Gospel of John. You know how we tell everybody, new believers, start in the Gospel of John. Well, I didn't know any better. I just opened up got one of those easy to understand Bibles. I started in Genesis. I started reading about these animal sacrifices. I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. I was a blank slate. I don't want to kill an animal. Man, where do they get these animals? Do they do this? Oh, this is, I didn't know any better. And I'm thinking, man, this is heavy. This is terrible. And you mean, every time I sin, there has to be a sacrifice for my sin. And then I got to the New Testament, and I realized that He was the sacrifice once and for all. And I'm going, thank you, God. I didn't want to kill any of these animals. And so you're there, the sacrifice. And so, this was good news, which is what the gospel means. But see, it brought so much more meaning now to the New Testament because I understood the Old Testament, which again points to the New. Well, let's bring it in for a landing here. Verse 32, also the right thigh you shall give to the priest as a heave offering from the sacrifices of your peace offerings. He among the sons of Aaron, who offers the blood of the peace offering and the fat, shall have the right thigh for his part. For the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the heave offering I have taken from the children of Israel, from the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and I have given them to Aaron the priest and to his sons from the children of Israel by a statute forever. This is the consecrated portion for Aaron and his sons from the offerings made by fire to the Lord on the day when Moses presented them to minister to the Lord as priests. The Lord commanded this to be given to them by the children of Israel on the day that He had anointed them by a statute forever throughout their generations. This is the law of the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, the trespass offering, the consecrations, and the sacrifice of the peace offering, which the Lord commanded Moses on Mount Sinai on the day when He commanded the children of Israel to offer their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. So we complete chapter 7, and in so doing, we complete the study of the 5 offerings and also see how Jesus specifically and precisely and perfectly fulfills all of the 5 offerings. David Guzik, who is now in Siegen, Germany, pastoring a Calvary Chapel there, also a Bible college there, did a wonderful work in his commentary on Jesus Christ and the sacrificial system. In other words, you have these offerings, all of which in every detail pointed to Jesus Christ. So, the first one, Hebrews 10:12, this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. So you have all 5 offerings. Now watch this. The first offering we saw in the first chapter, Leviticus 1. That was the burnt offering. Jesus Christ fulfills the burnt offering. Remember the sweet swelling aroma. Hey, I'm not doing too bad. We're almost done, and I've only messed up one time. Jesus Christ fulfills the burnt offering, Ephesians 5:2. As Christ also has loved us and given Himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Remember when God said to Moses, I want it to be a sweet-smelling aroma to me. That would picture the person and the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. He fulfills the grain offering and the first fruits offering. This was the second offering we saw in the second chapter, Leviticus 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20. But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The third offering was the peace offering, and we see this and studied this in Leviticus 3. But Romans 5:1, Jesus fulfills it. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. And then the fourth offering was the sin offering. We saw this in chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. For He made Him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in Him. In other words, He offered Himself as a sin offering offering to take our sin and pay for it in full, and fulfills the sin offering. The guilt offering, the 5th chapter and the 5th offering, Romans 4:25, who was delivered up because of our offenses and was raised because of our justification. And then Hebrews 10:10, which talks about how Jesus Christ fulfills all the sacrifices for us. The writer of Hebrews tells us we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. This is why we don't have to do these sacrifices anymore. You know, I wish we had time. I put together a whole chart here on these 5 offerings, the first of which were voluntary. And what I wanted to